Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlsen, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. Mexico's Day of the Dead holds a strange satisfaction to societies all over the world. The concept of death as a part of life and the dead coming back to reunite with the living once a year in the midst of colorful traditions is attractive, especially to societies where death is taboo. The movie Coco brought death to children in an especially heartfelt and direct way. Today we're going to talk to an author of children's book who's written stories about Day of the Dead. She's also written about a lot of other things. Judy Goldman has written more than 50 books for children. She's from here in Mexico City, and we're very happy to have her today on the show. Thank you, Judy, for being here.
Thanks for inviting me.
Judy, tell us about how you came to write a story about Day of the Dead for children.
Well, look, I have two books that are about Day of the Dead.
Oh.
And the one that was published here in Mexico is called Las Almas de la Fiesta y otros cuentos de Día de Muertos. It has 5 stories.
So that'd be like the souls of the party and
yeah,
other
like
stories.
the souls of the party and other stories of the Day of the Dead.
Mm-hmm.
And it has 5 stories based on the different traditions that take place in the country for the Day of the Dead, because Puebla has some traditions, Michoacan has others. So I investigated a lot, and when I found the tradition that I liked a lot, then I built a story around that tradition. And I came up with the characters and the situation, and then wrote the stories. So it was very interesting.
Did you find there were a lot of regional differences?
Well, there's some things that are always similar. There's always the flor de cempasúchil that is used always.
The marigold.
The
flower.
marigold, yeah. And because the petals are used to like make a path, which the souls can see so they don't get lost coming back to their homes. And there's always bread of some kind, food, photos of the people who have departed already, something to drink, candles, because the lit candles are important for light. So
They're also kind of a guide, aren't they?
Yeah, they are a guide. So there's always certain things that are always present, but the bread is different many times. For instance, the bread that's made here in Mexico City is the pan de muerto, which is the round one with the little bones on the top, with lots of sugar. And then there's other kinds that are made in other places where they're shaped like people. There's like a little head with the arms and the legs. And there's more traditional food. For instance, maybe the food from Michoacan that they use there is not the same as the food that's used in Morelos, for instance.
Well, part of the idea is that you put out the kind of food that the person
Exactly.
ate in life.
So I've been busy promoting the book because it's the season right now, and I hope it'll do well.
Did you just finish? Did you just recently publish this book?
This was published last year. And it was illustrated by Israel Barron, who's from Jalapa, and it was published by Castillo. Also, I wanted to let people know who published it. It's part of a series because I've been working with them. This is the second book that I've done with them. The other one is called El Bailarín del Sol y otros cuentos mayas, which are it's kind of like the dancer of the sun, and other stories from the Maya area. And the third one should be out next year. So, and all the books have 5 stories. So it's a series that each book will have 5 stories that has to do with the main theme.
Oh, great. Well, how do you build characters around the Day of the Dead? What are some of the characters?
Well, I took, for instance, I made one story that has to do with a boy and a dog. And I love dogs. And it has to do with that the dog starts getting older and older and older, and at some time or other the dog has to be put to sleep. So it's this thing that you can grieve for a pet just as much as you can grieve for a person, and you can build an altar of the Day of the Dead for a pet just as much as you could do it for a person.
And that relationship is so real to children, often between children and animals.
And I think it's important that they should know that they can grieve for a pet also.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes it gets trivialized in
Yes.
some ways, you know, the death of a pet. Oh, it's just a dog
Oh,
that
yeah.
died or
Who
something.
cares, right? No,
Yeah.
but when you love pets, when you love dogs and cats and birds and things like that, it's important to grieve.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you mentioned that you're doing this series on Mayan stories. And I wanted to show people this book called Cuentos Mayas, or Mayan Stories, which is one of Judy's most recent books with beautiful illustrations here. How did you get involved in writing books on the Mayan culture, pre-Hispanic culture?
Well, I started researching folktales quite a few years ago. And I love
Pre-Hispanic folktales?
pre-Hispanic or even maybe not pre-Hispanic, colonial, and I loved them, especially the stories from the Mayan area.
Mexican in particular.
Yeah, Mexican in particular. And what I love especially about the stories from the area of Yucatan and Chiapas and around that area is the stories about animals. Because they have a lot to do with, you know, why they have certain characteristics or why they act a certain way, and it's been fascinating. So
give us an example of an animal personality.
Well, there's, for instance, if I can take a look at here, there's one story here that talks about how there's an interchange of feathers between some birds, because there's one little bird who's very, you know, drab, okay, and there's going to be a contest to name which is the king of all the birds, because they argue all day long about who sings prettier and who's got the nicest feathers and who's, you know, who can fly farther and whatever. So the God that created them one day says he's had enough. He's going to make a contest to see which is the best bird, and that's going to be crowned the king of all the birds. So the turkey, it's a turkey. He has a beautiful singing voice, but he's got very drab feathers also. And this other little bird, this tiny little thing, has got the most beautiful feathers. So the turkey comes up to him and tells him, "Lend me your feathers, and then when I'm named the king, because I have the most beautiful singing voice of all, then I'll share everything with you." So the little drab bird, the little bird gives his feathers to the drab turkey. He puts them on and he struts into where all the birds are showing off, you know, which one's the smartest and which one's this and that and the other. And he sings, and everyone says he has to be the king of all the birds. But then he gets so full of himself that he forgets his promise to the little bird, who's been hiding under bush all the time, no feathers, freezing all the time. And so when the other birds find the other one that's practically, you know, freezing already and hungry and everything, each one gives him a feather so that he'll be able to be warm again. And then they go and search for the turkey. And when they find him, they drag him up to where the god is, and the god punishes him by taking away his singing voice. But
I was going to say at the beginning, turkey's a beautiful singing book.
Yeah, so he runs off, but he keeps all the feathers. And that little tiny bird that gave him the feathers is still looking for him. So you see, so it explains why that little tiny bird goes along the pathways in the Mayan area saying "pucuyo, pucuyo," because he's looking for the turkey who stole his feathers.
Give him a piece of his mind.
Exactly, and get his feathers back. Okay.
Wait, so when you write these stories, do you retell the traditional stories?
I do usually, because I look for as many versions of the story as I can, because I want to be sure that it's a real traditional folktale. Because there's people who write tales that are like folktales, but they're not. And it's perfectly legit. I have nothing against that. But you can't say that it's a really old folktale that has been passed on from generation to generation. So I research a lot. And then when I find a tale that I know that has 3 or 4 or 6 versions or whatever, then I feel confident enough to do my own version. Now, some of these stories are like maybe 2 lines in a magazine or a book. So I have to flesh it out, because I'm not going to rewrite a story that way. So what I do is I say that those 2 lines are like the skeleton, and I add dialogue and description, and I, you know, add some characters and things like, you know, secondary characters and things like that, so that you make it come alive.
Yeah. Well, this book also has beautiful illustrations. Tell us about the illustrator.
Well, the illustrator is Angel Campos. And in a picture book like this, the illustrations are very, very important because they illuminate the text. And these stories are, a story of a picture book is sometimes maybe 1,000 words or less. So you can't go on and on with description, and and you can't say that, that so-and-so Joey had brown eyes and red hair, because the illustrator will do it in the illustration. So,
and in a children's book, you just don't want that extensive of a text.
Besides, because these are books that they're usually used to teach children to read, or they're books where parents read to children. So you don't really need to describe that much. If it's a jungle setting, why describe? You might say it's in a jungle, but you don't have to say that there were, these trees and that trees and these plants and whatever, because the illustrator will do it. So Angel did a wonderful job. I think he's a great illustrator, and
he's from here.
He's from here, from Mexico. The other day we had a book presentation, and he was talking about that he's from the area of Ixtapalapa. When before the Central de Abasto was there, that was there were chinampas there. That was where they were agricultural fields, and that his father was a farmer. So because we were asked, Roxana, the editor, asked us if we were close to nature, because all these stories have to do with animals and nature. And yes, both of us have that link with nature also.
What's your link?
What's my link? I love dogs and I love animals, and I.
Do you live more out in the country now, or did you grow up?
No. I grew up, well, when I was a kid and my parents moved to Lomas, it was like living out in the country. It was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And there were cows and pigs and sheep around there. And so it was a little bit like a country setting with, streets and street lights and things like that. But I've always been interested in animals and plants and birds and insects. And when my kids were small, we would go exploring in the garden, for instance. So it's just something that I enjoy very much.
And it's reflected in most of your stories.
Yes, it is.
Well, what age group are you looking at mostly when in these stories, or when you write in general?
I have a hard time putting reader ages on my books. I let my editors do that. Because I've always thought also that, for instance, there's children who maybe they're 8 years old and they're reading at a 6-year-old level for whatever reason. They might have problems learning how to read, or some sort of, maybe they have dyslexia or something like that. So I don't want to limit them. And then there's children who are 6 years old who are maybe reading at a 8-year-old level.
Yeah.
Okay, and then so.
And then adults can read, much higher level books to much younger children.
Yeah. And now there's a lot of grown-ups who are not embarrassed to be seen reading books for children. Because I've seen a lot of grown-ups, they come to the book fairs and they'll buy a book like this because they think it's beautiful.
Yeah.
And they'll enjoy reading the stories, and then maybe they'll share it with their kids.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah. And it doesn't, do you usually think about like a developmental age? We're talking then mostly though kind of primary school.
Well, yeah. I have books for toddlers also. So those are harder to write than anything else. The shorter the story, the harder it is to write it. It sounds a little bit unbelievable, but it's true, because every word has to count. You can't go off and on and on, on and on and on. It's like I'm not a poet, and someone told me one day that writing a picture book is like writing poetry, because every word has to be the right word.
And every word has to advance the story, because you have to get to the end in 100 words.
Yeah. I've written some things that are 50 words, and you have to tell the story in 50 words. Not at all easy. Not at all easy.
I bet.
Yeah, and then if you write for older kids, for maybe 5th, 6th grade, then you can write longer. You can put in more description, make something a little bit, maybe, have subplots and things like that you usually can't in stories for younger kids, maybe, picture books, chapter books, that sort of thing.
more character development and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Do you, besides nature, we've talked about nature and we've talked about the pre-Hispanic folk tales, are there any other subjects that you find yourself coming back to in your writing?
Usually I write about Mexico. It's
In general?
In general. In general, I think most of my books are set in Mexico. And I just find my country endlessly fascinating.
Why?
Why? Because there's always something new. You know, there's always, wherever you go in the country, say you go to Oaxaca or you go to Chiapas or you go to Zacatecas, there's so much richness, cultural richness in the country. The food, the music, the stories, the museums, the way the people dress for their traditional celebrations. It's endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that it's something that's pretty much universally recognized when I talk to visitors, like, well, how'd you choose to come here on your vacation or whatever? It's something that's sometimes difficult to describe, but that comes up a lot. So when you say you write about Mexico, what are some other examples of stories that you have?
Well, for instance, I have a book once about the edible bugs from Mexico, and another one about the flowers, the edible flowers. And
that's one of the things I love, especially Oaxaca. They eat everything. I mean, you know, everything edible.
Everything edible. And I did those books with my son, who's a very talented photographer. He's a professional photographer. So we had a lot of fun because we also went to the markets to find, you know, the ingredients. And for instance, one day we went to the market in San Juan downtown and to look for the insects that are in the corn, at the top of the corn. And we wanted to find at least two corns with the insect. And the guy who we asked him to find them, he kept on peeling the corn and saying, this one doesn't have insects. And we told him, but we wanted to have insects. So he finally found two. It had the insect there.
So is it the worm or what?
It's the worm, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so he finally found us two. Because he thought we didn't want the worm. We said, we do. We do, no? So that was a really nice experience.
Did you eat it?
No. My son did.
Oh, he did?
Yeah,
How'd
he
he cook
did.
it?
He fried it. He kind of, put it on the comal and he kind of grilled it. What would you call it? It's a little bit like a grill, no?
Well, so did the book come out with the stories and the photographs?
Yeah, well, it wasn't really, it's a nonfiction book. So it came out with information about each of the insects that were included. And it became both books were included in the Programa Nacional de Lectura here in Mexico, one of the
National Reading Program?
National Reading Program of the Ministry of Education. So they're in lots of classrooms, which is a very nice thing to happen. Yeah. And then I've got other stories that are set in Mexico that have been. Some were published in the U.S. Most of the books are published here in Mexico. And it's.
But you have some translations too, don't you?
I'm a translator, but I've translated work of other people.
But I mean, your books have been translated
into Portuguese because some were bought in Brazil.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but mostly it's here in Mexico. And
about Mexico.
Yeah, about Mexico. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think is what really attracts people about Mexico, both us as Mexicans and about people abroad? What kind of stories are you looking for that captures what you consider kind of like the essence of Mexico, or is it the diversity itself?
I think it's the diversity. I think there's a huge amount of ignorance about the native groups from Mexico that are not the Aztecs and the Mayas, and of the groups that up
and
north.
And they're not the past. Because,
exactly. No, actual.
Yeah.
Actual. And I think there's a lot of ignorance, even of many of us who are from Mexico. We don't really know much about these groups. And I think it's important that, if I can in some way let some of the stories be known, I think it's good. I think it's good because it's another little part of Mexico which is very important. It might be little, but it's important.
Yeah, and not so little. I mean, there's millions of people who still carry on indigenous cultures.
Yeah, but there's some groups that are practically dying out already,
true,
because there's maybe 100 people of the tribe group left, and the language is dying out because the younger kids are not learning the language.
And it seems like a terrible loss to humanity in some broad sense.
But then there's other groups now that the younger kids are learning the language because they're making rock and roll music and they're rapping in their language.
Yeah.
So I think that's amazing.
Renovating the language.
Yeah, they're renovating it, which I think is great.
Which is what culture is all about.
Yeah. And then there's stereotypes also. You know, they think that they're, you know, okay, there's a lot of people, for instance, in Oaxaca, the women wear the huipiles. But they're also, you know, everyone's got cell phones and, you know, so it's not that they're, you know, living like maybe 100 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the reasons I ask that question too is because we're facing, especially when we look at what's happening in the United States, you know, the image that's being constructed from the top down, and by that I mean the presidency of Mexico, is so negative of Mexico and of Mexicans, as well as now of Central Americans. So there's this kind of almost, some people would say, folkloric attraction to the country. There's also a lot of racism.
Oh yeah.
And a lot of thinking of Mexico as just this lawless, criminal, corrupt nation without many redeeming qualities. Do you think that this kind of work, I mean, do you hope that this kind of work can counteract in some ways those images?
I hope so, because I listen a lot when I go to the U.S., for instance. They tell me, oh, but you live in Mexico City, and it's like, it's so dangerous. And I say, and there aren't dangerous parts where you live that you wouldn't go to because you know they're dangerous? If it's Houston or Chicago or whatever. And they go, yeah. I say, well, it's the same thing.
Yeah, statistically, it's no worse.
Exactly.
And I say, big cities anywhere.
And what we have to get across, and what a lot of people find out when they finally do come to Mexico, is that the people are very welcoming. We're warm-hearted. Not everyone's out there to, you know, kill people and, you know, sell them drugs and things like that. Most people are very nice here.
Yeah.
Most of them.
Yeah. Yeah, and it has this incredibly rich culture.
Exactly. That's why a lot of people come here and they stay here.
Yeah. Let's talk a little about the writing process for writing children's books or any kind of writing, and everyone has their own writing process. Do you have a certain number of hours a day that you write, or do you sit down? Because you seem to be very prolific.
I've been at this for a long time already. Okay, so I try to write every day. I try to sit down at the computer at 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm a morning person, so I work better in the morning. But you know, there's always things to do, and sometimes I can't. So I try to do it in the afternoon if I can, and then there's days that I just can't. But I try to meet deadlines. When my editors tell me I need this in a certain date, I usually do turn over things on those dates. I try very hard.
It's good to have an external structure there.
Yeah. But I can't really say that I have, you know, always the same schedule.
Do you have any rituals or any surroundings that you prefer for writing?
Well, I have a very nice office in my house that's full of books, and I put on music, and I put my dog bed next to me so she lets me work and she goes to sleep for a while. and I listen to music very, very low because if not it distracts me, but I do need a little bit of music. And I just take up what I left off from the day before and advance at least, I try to advance 3 pages a day maybe. Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes it's 1. And other times it might be 3 or 4. It all depends on what I'm working on. And sometimes I'm working on several projects at the same time, so you can't be changing your hats to, you know, you're working on something here that's pre-Hispanic, and then here maybe it's a contemporary story set in Mexico, so you have to turn off the chip from the pre-Hispanic things and turn on the chip for the contemporary thing.
Well, it sounds fascinating, and it's been a real pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for the invitation.
And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.